I've been in prison behind my painting in this limbo for 60 years now since my death. I think half that time I've spent in listening to that monster snore. My God, it's waking up.
The British home video world of the early 1980s was something of a Wild West, awash with chancers, conmen and other characters keen to make a quick buck in this brave new world of unregulated opportunity. Nothing perhaps sums this up more than the story of Deathbed, The Bed That Eats, a film that under normal circumstances would have completely vanished into obscurity as an unfinished project by a would-be filmmaker, but which instead found itself released on VHS in the UK, where it would be stumbled upon by horror fans who watched the film with amazement. A national press campaign meant that the film possibly even had a bigger audience than simply horror completists. And all this took place while the film's director remained entirely clueless to the fact that his incomplete movie had been seen by anyone. Settle back, dear viewer. This is as strange a cinematic tale as you are ever likely to hear. The story of Deathbed, The Bed That Eats begins in the early 1970s with wannabe filmmaker George Barry, who, in the great tradition of directors starting out on their career by shooting something that couldn't fail, decided to make a horror film. The perceived wisdom back then and beyond was that horror films were a great way of breaking into the business. They were cheap to make, didn't need big stars and had a steady audience. No one was going to become rich making micro-budget horror movies, but they would most likely turn a small profit if you could sell them to a distributor and act as a calling card for your career. Many a successful director began his career with similar fare. Of course, far more people managed to make one or two films that no one saw before slipping back into obscurity, or simply found themselves stuck in a rut, forever doomed to grind out zero-budget exploitation flicks, which was fine if that was what you liked, but a bit disheartening for anyone hoping to be the next Francis Ford Coppola. And you still had to actually complete the movie. In the 1970s, when everything had to be shot on film, there was still a certain skill level required and considerable costs involved. Even if you shot on 16mm, the raw materials were not cheap. If you needed to hire a cinematographer, and unless you were trained in using movie cameras, you almost certainly did, then that would cost too. So would everything else. Even if you had a cast and crew working for nothing, you'd still have to pay for special effects, catering, all those basic things that add up. And a lot of movies didn't get a release, at least not outside regional areas. More, a number that we'll probably never know, didn't even get finished. Even if the movie was shot, even if it was well into post-production, then the money could still run out. Because post-production is often where favours no longer count, and where people want paying. This often is where you pitch your movie as a work in progress to would-be distributors or financiers who might supply that last bit of cash to get you over the hump and into completion. All this brings us back to Deathbed, The Bed That Eats. George Barry, a Detroit-based would-be filmmaker, shot the film around 1972 on a budget that would eventually stretch to $30,000. A pitiful amount, but not exceptionally low for a project like this. The film followed the traditional path. A cast of friends, hopefuls and stage performers who would work for free or at least very little money, and a crew made up mostly of Canadians in order to avoid the various production union rules that were then being strictly enforced and which made many a low-budget film have to sail under the radar simply in order to get made. The film was shot by Canadian documentarian Robert Fresco, who would go on to a solid, if unremarkable, career as a cinematographer, documentary maker and music video director. The eccentric soundtrack was by Mike McCoy, who is not known for much else, and more or less everything else behind the camera was handled by Barry. The cast included Dave Marsh, the editor of rock music magazine Cream, as the artist, a figure based on Aubrey Beardsley. And if the presence of Beardsley in a low-budget American horror film made you sit up and pay attention, then get ready, because Deathbed is, without question, one of the weirdest films ever made. Deathbed tells the story of a demonically created bed that devours all who sleep in it. The bed, it turns out, was created by a lustful demon in order to seduce a human woman that he took a fancy to. Sadly, this being an unnatural union, the woman died and the demon took it rather badly. His eyes shatter, spilling blood onto the bed and giving it life. He then took up residence in a nearby tree. Demons, it turns out, sleep once every 10 years, during which time the bed is powerless. But in the meantime, it keeps alive an artist who was dying of consumption and now lives behind a painting above the bed, acting as the film's narrator and philosopher. We hear various stories of the bed's victims over the years, even as 3 young women arrive at the abandoned house where it resides and slowly fall victim to it, before the demon sleeps and events take a dramatic turn. Deathbed is a dreamlike bad trip of a film, full of strange, stilted performances that may or may not be the result of bad acting, awkward attempts at humour, and moments of genuine beauty and inventiveness. It's unlike anything else out there. Just how deliberate the weirdness is remains unknown. A lot of micro-budget American horror films of the 1970s, especially those made far from the filmmaking centres of Los Angeles and New York, have a decidedly oddball style in both narrative and execution. These are true outsider films, shot by people with no real filmmaking experience, at a time when it was a lot more difficult to simply make a movie than it is today. Thanks to advances in digital production, you can shoot a film now with no money and only domestic-level camcorders. Or not even camcorders, thanks to the advances in phone camera quality, and it will probably at least look like a proper movie. You can download free editing software that's of a professional standard, buy off-the-shelf post-production plugins, and watch no end of tutorials that will ensure that your film will at least stand a good chance of being passably professional, unless you try very hard. But back in the day, the rules of filmmaking were a lot more fluid, and you could get fascinating productions like this one from filmmakers who either didn't know the filmmaking conventions or simply didn't care about them. American indie horror cinema of the 1970s and early 1980s is a fascinating landscape of artistic experimentation, surreal ideas, and bloody-minded oddness that would have been hailed as daring underground cinema if it wasn't connected to such a disrespected genre. Deathbed feels like one of those movies, even if we accept that this was a film made by amateurs who didn't know what they were doing. That hardly explains the sheer volume of bizarre ideas that dominate the movie. This is something unlike anything else that you will have seen before. It was certainly a startling experience when I first saw it around 1985, one that immediately burned itself into my mind. You know when you've seen something special. I spent the next few years telling everyone I could about this crazy film, usually to complete indifference. I was the first person to ever review the movie in the second edition of my fanzine Sheer Filth in 1987. I mention this only because there have been several people credited with discovering Deathbed or first writing about it, and I'm petty enough to claim my place as the original champion of the film. I first saw the film purely by accident. I had been grabbed by a full-page ad in the Sunday People from Portland Films, offering a collection of clearance tapes that had a short window before the Video Recordings Act rendered them illegal. I sent away for a copy of Elsa, Fraulein SS, being young and naive enough to hope that it might be a retitled copy of the infamous Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, which of course it wasn't. But the tape came with a sort of catalogues and sales sheets for hundreds of tapes, with an offer that I seem to recall was something like 5 for £30 or thereabouts. I noticed that amongst the tapes on offer was Don't Look in the Basement, which had briefly been a video nasty. Obviously, I was having that, but when my 5-tape package arrived, there was disappointment awaiting. Portland had been made aware of the infamy of Don't Look in the Basement and withdrawn the film from sale. Rather than simply refunding me, they had replaced it with something else. Deathbed, The Bed That Eats was that replacement. This was a film that I had never heard of beyond its inclusion in the catalogues and the press ads, and not one that I might have spent money on normally. But as I now owned a copy, I figured that I might as well watch the damn thing. The weirdness of Deathbed was overwhelming, and it began immediately with the opening titles, which were intriguingly incomplete. Rather than the usual cast and crew credits, the film simply flashed the words "credits" and "effects" on the screen. It didn't take a genius to work out that this was in some way an incomplete production, that the producers had somehow forgotten to add in these final details, which was not quite true but close enough. In fact, director George Barry, the only name to appear on the film, had fallen foul of early 1980s British video distributors and their disregard for copyright, ownership, or anything else. Let's go back to the production of Deathbed. After the original shoot, Barry edited the film for over 5 years. Not constantly, obviously, but as time allowed. The movie's production had swallowed up the entire budget by this point, and so Barry was forced to work on the movie between other paying jobs. By 1977, however, he had more or less a finished film. There may have still been a few technical issues that he might have wanted to improve, but his hands were generally tied by the time that had elapsed between the shoot and the finished movie. He could hardly call people back for reshoots at this stage. He began to look for a distributor for the film, at first without success due to completion and 35mm blow-up costs. He was eventually offered $1,000 for a VHS release of the film if he could finish off those opening titles. Again, this was long before you could just knock this stuff up on your computer. Finishing the titles would have cost $3,000, an amount that Barry couldn't stretch to, especially given the price that he'd been offered. He declined the offer, and the print of the film that he had sent to the distributor was returned to him. But not, clearly, before it had been digitized. Now, Barry says the distributor in question was in Los Angeles, and so just how a copy of the film ended up in the hands of Portland Films is anyone's guess. But it did. Portland Films was primarily a retailer with a West End shop selling much the same material as found in their mail-order catalogue, and a distributor of other labels such as Mountain, but did issue a few titles under their own name. These were mostly public domain films and obscure movies that we can assume, in retrospect, that they probably didn't own the rights to. For Portland, the missing opening credits were not a deal breaker, given that they were not actually making a deal anyway. Whether they'd paid anyone for the master copy or were simply sent it to check out is anyone's guess, But the company was not about to allow minor issues like distribution rights to get in their way. What were the chances that George Barry would ever find out that his film had been released? Of course, back in 1983, when the VHS tape was released, the internet was nothing but a fantasy, and even as that, no one expected that a global communications network would be used to discuss obscure old movies on forums in an attempt to one-up other contributors. But there you go. Discussion about Deathbed did indeed make its way to movie forums, and George Barry stumbled across it. He was, as you might expect, surprised to discover that his unreleased, unfinished film had a minor cult following, thanks to the handful of people that had bought it from Portland Films, the other editions that had somehow made their way to Australia and Spain, and the tape trading scene where obscure oddities were very much in demand with the people who'd moved on from simply collecting video nasties and other banned films. Making himself known, Barry soon found himself in demand. He was sought out for interviews, and then Steve Thrower became the official champion of the movie, helping get it completed and supplying new music to replace the original score. I did have rather mixed feelings about this. It seemed that Deathbed had existed for so long in the version issued by Portland that this was, in effect, the proper version. The new edition felt a little bit like reworking a classic film with new visual effects or additional footage. Interesting, but not the definitive edition, no matter how much you might call it the director's cut. Still, this new version made its way to release in 2003, first appearing at film festivals and then on DVD. As with all such cases, people who'd never heard of the film previously were now talking about it as if they had intimate knowledge of it and hailing it as an essential release. Which it was, of course. However, Deathbed has not had universal praise since its belated director-approved edition. It's a film that is a lot too out there for the tastes of the new breed of horror fan who wants everything to be mainstream and serious. A movie about a bed that eats people with its odd mix of melancholy and slapstick, surrealism and 1970s strangeness, that was never going to become approved of in the way that more consciously arty horror films of the era, the Ganja and Hessers, the Messiah of Evils, would be. Deathbed was, and remains, just that little bit too weird, a bit too much of a slice of outsider cinema to really have that widespread appeal. Yet for those of us who never quite recovered from that first viewing, who sat in slack-jawed amazement from the opening scene to the final moment, this is a film that feels like a genuine work of art. Accidental art, maybe. An individual vision, certainly. It's a film that's unlike anything else that you will ever see, and in a world of increasingly interchangeable, personality-free genre pieces that are too busy waving their cultural importance in the viewer's faces, or pastiche cult movies that are simply trying too hard to be eccentric, movies like this, genuinely strange, messy, and outsider efforts, feel all the more important. The film is still available, now on Blu-ray, and if you haven't seen it yet, I suggest you seek it out immediately. For the full original experience, however, try to find a transfer of that original VHS release. For those of you keen to know more about the production of Deathbed, The Bed That Eats, I would suggest seeking out a copy of Steve Thrower's book Nightmare USA, which contains an extensive interview with George Barry, or indeed the commentary track on the DVD release, also by Thrower and Barry. Thrower also supplied the finished film with new opening and closing title music, and has become very much the public face of the film's fanbase. He's done a great job of bringing this film to a much wider audience than we ever thought would see it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.